Hello everyone, welcome back to lecture. Starting off of it, we have our attendance form, so scan this and make sure you get your attendance. All right. Has everyone gotten it? Okay, nice. So today we'll be going over a few things. Welcome. Oh, this is attendance one. Nice. All right, so today we will be learning about intent and some other things along the way. Just a little heads up, this week there is a little bit more course material in comparison to the past 2 weeks. So that's just a heads up, and you should. We have a lot more slides and a lot more material to cover from now on. So let's go over what intents are. Intents are an abstract description of an operation that is to be performed, and most significantly, it is used to launch your different activities. So, for example, if I want to launch from one screen to another, I will use an intent. And there are two types. There are explicit and there are implicit intents. Now, for explicit intents, they're what you use in order to switch inside your app, right? So if you want to switch between one component of your project to another component. So say you have two different screens, what will happen is you will use an intent to switch from, let's just say, your main screen to your secondary screen. So, for example, let's just say you're on your messaging app. When you're on your base messaging app, you see all of everyone's messages, and you click on someone's message. You use an intent to go to another screen that has your actual text with your friends, right? It's called explicit because you must be specific on where the destination is. It has to be a specific location within your activity or within your entire project. So this is the basic syntax for it. What you do is you first have this val intent equals intent, and so this represents I'm going from this activity that I'm currently in to the target activity. And you might be wondering what this class.java is. It's just so that there's backwards compatibility with Java, because we're writing everything in Kotlin, but we want to make sure there's still backwards compatibility through Java. So this is just basic syntax. Next line, it's intent.putExtra. What putExtra does is you're putting extra information to pass in onto the next intent. So, for example, let's just say you want to pass in, let's just say you're trying to get an eatery name. Let's just say I clicked on the banner that has clicked on the banner. Like if I want eatery, and I clicked on the banner for Oakenshields, well, I want to tell my next activity, like, hey, I'm going to Oakenshields in my activity. And so you type this in. So this here, it's kind of like a dictionary in a sense, or a hash map, where you have the name that points to the actual value. So this could be anything you want, and then that's the actual information you want to pass in, right? And then finally, to actually launch the activity, you have to have this line called start activity. What's it called? And on the other side, when you actually are in that activity, you use this line here to retrieve that information. So you get the intent, you get the extra, and then when you do get string, it gets the string from Oakenshields, basically. Right? So you can pass in a bunch of different information. It's not just strings. You can pass in strings, numbers, booleans, and even objects. All right. Next slide. So let's just go over an example of the intent flow inside our app that you guys are hopefully all familiar with, Eatery. So say, for example, we click on bare necessities, right? What this does is you want it to transition to the specific screen with all of the information about the eatery, right? And that's partly related to backend and networking and stuff like that, but we'll go over that in the future. What ends up happening is when I click on it, I create an intent, right? And what I do is I set the eatery name to bare necessities. What that ultimately does is on the other side of the activity, I will go into our database and I'll say, hey, I want the information on this specific eatery name, and this specific eatery name here is bare necessities. And so then I will pull up that screen and with all the information that is necessary. So this makes it so that, and the reason why you want to pass in information is these two screens are just two separate screens. I mean, my bad. This screen you see on the right hand side is used for every single eatery, right? So, all you want to do is change, let's just say, for example, the name, when it's open, the location, the time, and all this. But the general graphics you want to stay the same. And so the only thing, the thing that you want to do here is that when you pass in the name informs the backend like, hey, I want to populate it with the bare necessities information. And if I click on this, I want to populate it with Lewis's information. So it's very important to one of the reasons why you want to pass in information is so you can use screens for multiple different multiple different eateries in this case. Now let's talk about implicit activity or implicit intents. So implicit intents, what they're doing is you're not requesting to go to a specific component, but instead you're declaring a general action, right, to perform. So, for example, say you want the user to, you want to show the user their location on a map, right? You can use an implicit intent to request that another capable app show that location. So, say for example, when I use an implicit intent, I have different map apps on my. Actually, that's not a particularly good example. Say for example, you want to share when you're watching a TikTok video and you click share. What ends up happening is it pulls up a huge list of apps that you can share the link with. So it could be like your messages. You can share it on for example, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all of those things. It doesn't care what specific app you share it on, and so what Google will do or what Android will do is they'll pull up a whole entire list to show hey, these are the things that can perform this intent that you wanted, right? And so here are some examples, right? Like starting a phone call, sharing information, opening a browser, and taking a photo. Because you could have multiple different ways of taking photos, you could have multiple different ways of opening your browser, etc. Right? And also on top of that, some implicit intent structures require you to send in extra information. So, for example, if you're trying to write an email, right? When you're writing an email, you need to give it specific information, like who you want to send it to, the body of the text, the subject of it, and all of this you have to put into the put extra. You have to put it through the put extra thing. Now, this is, for example, an example of emailing, right? So there are specific names when you do an implicit intent here in order to, all right, there are specific constants I would give the name for where you want to put this type of information. And that's exactly where it'll grab it. So here is the documentation for it. So, for example, intent.extramail, this is the string array for all your mail addresses. So when you do a put extra there, you want to make it so that your email here contains all your two emails that it contains, and etc. Right? So here we have an intent. It's a slightly different not documentation. syntax, but in general, it's the same idea where you're putting in the information that you need, and then you start the activity, and then it'll pull up the ways you can send email. So it could be like Gmail, it could be Outlook, etc. Right? Can I play this video? So, just in case you guys weren't exactly sure what it is, this is an example of sharing a message. So see here, you can share with many different people and using many different apps, right? And it's a very nice and simple way to add a share functionality. You only have to write like 4 or 5 lines of code to be able to like implement, let's just say, sharing, right? Next, we have sending data to system phone app. So you see here, when you do call number, it will pull up the actual app to actually call the number. When you click on, for example, get direction, it will pull up Google Maps to actually get you to the location that you want. And this enables it so that your app can now be part of an entire ecosystem, and you don't actually have to build all of the sharing, let's say get location features on your own. You can implicitly direct it to other apps that probably do it better than you could do. Next, we have results from activities. So what this does is, let's just say you first go into an activity. Well, maybe you want to get some information back from that activity. For example, if you are launching an app to take a photo, right? Well, after it's done taking a photo, you want it to return that photo so you can use it later. So say, for example, you're trying to take a profile pic for yourself, right? You get a profile pic, but you actually want to get that photo back into your app so you can set it as your profile pic. In this case, you would use this in order to actually get that information back for yourself. And this could be used on both implicit and explicit intents. So this is the function that you want to use in order to call it. So let's go over exactly the syntax for how it actually works. So here in your onCreate, what ends up happening is you create, this is just, you don't have to actually remember how to do this. We give you the syntax, you just have to copy it. You create this contract, which says, hey, once I get my result, like here's what I will do with it. After the other activity returns the information that I am requesting. Right. And so this is the data that, or this is the code for the activity that's actually sending back the information. Right. So here you create an intent, you put the extra information, you set the result, and here there is a unique integer. This just is like a unique identifier for the information that you are sending back. And the reason why this is incredibly important is because when you are sending back information, well, there could be many different formats and then many different pieces of information that you can send back to the same activity. And this unique integer is what represents exactly what is what represents like, oh, and how you identify like what information is getting sent back, right? So you can actually parse it properly. So here, for example, I set the info key as high, and so when I get it back, I'm not sure the keys in results, right? It could be many different things, and so, but because I know of the unique integer, I can get the result data without I can actually get the result data, right? So, yeah. Next, there are manifests. You most likely will not have to deal with a lot of it, but it is an important aspect of Android Studio that you need to know about. So the manifest is kind of like that one file that contains crucial information of the actual app, and it's like, it contains the names, the activities, and it contains the basic structure of your entire app. It tells you like how I want my entire app to be structured. Right. So as I said, it contains the names of your activities, the fragments, your permissions that you want, and the software requirements. And in general, Android Studio will automatically populate your manifest. So as you create more and more activities, it will automatically be populated into the manifest. Next, we have the app launcher. So every application must specify the activity that's set as the entry point for your app. So normally that would be main activity. But say, for example, you want it to be something else. You wanted to start at another activity that you created. Well, this is the spot to go to in order to change what app is, what app or what activity actually starts first. In addition, this is the place where you will actually type in like what permissions you want to request. So as we're talking about, now we got permissions. So common permissions include location, internet use, user storage, and the camera. And for these, and for specific permissions, you need to request it in the manifest file. So, for example, we have this one. If you put this line into the manifest, this will request access for your location. Now, there are two types of permissions. There are normal and there are dangerous. So, for normal ones that are automatically granted, however, for dangerous ones, you have to ask for permission, which is why when you open up apps, they will have this pop-up like, hey, can we have access to your files, access to your location, because they most of the time impose on the privacy of the user. So here is a dangerous permission, right? You might have seen this. It says, will you allow this app to access your photos, media, and files on your device? And a lot of the times you want to be as transparent as possible on why you're requesting these specific permissions. So, for example, if on Google Maps, if you're not willing to give your permission, you basically cannot use this app. And so a lot of the times, users will allow you to grant permissions based on how much utility they can gain from, or additional utility they can gain from using your app while that permission is granted. Because people do not want want their private information to be leaked to advertising networks or and such. Now, the thing about permissions is that your app should be able to respond to all the situations whether the user grants it or whether they don't. So the situations account for when the user denies all your permissions. Like, what will your app? You have to think about in the user flow. What will your app do when the user has denied all permissions? And also there's also the possibility where the user has only requested or granted permission to use these permissions when the app is open, and finally, when the user has allowed for all of the permissions to be granted all the time. Or it could be the case where the user has only granted some permissions. Like, you have to make sure to address all of these different, how your app will function when some or all of these permissions are granted. So this is an example where this is an example where the user denied the permissions, and because the permissions are essential to be able to actually use the app then requests and puts up this pop-up that says, hey, your permissions are denied, and as a result, you either have to close the app, or you can prompt them to change that and enable the permission so that they can request permissions again and actually use the app. These are some more examples of when your apps have been denied permissions, and these are like specific screens from TikTok where because they don't have permissions, they can't do specific things. Right. Next, let's go over the workflow on how you think about using permissions. In general, you want to use permissions as little as possible. If you don't need it, you shouldn't ask. If you do, you add them to the manifest, and you have to explicitly ask the user to request to use a specific permission. So this is kind of like a flow chart on whether or not you should ask for permissions and how you'd go about it. So starting off with number 1, can you provide functionality without declaring permissions? If you can, then just fulfill the cases without using permissions, right? Otherwise, if you need the permissions in order to actually use a portion of your app, you should declare the permissions in your manifest file. And what this will do, and so as a result, you'll say, is the permission a runtime permission? If it is not, a runtime permission is one of those dangerous permissions. If it is not, doesn't matter. You can say no further action needed. If it is, you have to actually request for those permissions at runtime. So for the syntax, Android Studio has very, very complicated ways of asking for permissions, but we are going to be using a library called Easy Permissions in order to make the process a lot easier and to reduce the amount of syntax you have to use. So here, to use this library, what we have to do is you have to put this line into your build.gradle. Your build.gradle is what contains all of your additional files, and afterwards, after you put it in build.gradle, normally you have to rebuild your Gradle so that it's actually like incorporated into your code. Now using this library, here is the actual syntax for how you request for permissions. So you can this is for step number 2. You override the Android default permission handling flow by adding this in, right? And here you put in this line to request for the specific permissions that you want to request, and this will make it so that on runtime it will actually request for the permissions when the user opens up the app. Number 3, you want to make it so that you're actually declaring these permissions in your manifest. You just put these lines of code inside your manifest. Finally, you want to make it so that you have unique request codes for each permission. These are just like steps you have to do. There's pretty basic. There's just like syntax you have to do. And this is an example of requesting for permissions in the onCreate. So you have it so that here we have this easy permission library that we're using, and this is all code that you should just copy paste. You don't have to memorize it, other than like how you want to use it. And so for this, we have easy permission, the request for permission, and host, which is obviously this, yada yada. And the request code here is this is like the request code that you put in for earlier in step, I believe, 3, for like what specific permission you're requesting. And let's just say, for example, they do not. This is just all for requesting it. And let's just say, for example, they've already let's just say, for example, you already have the permissions. This is where the rest of your code goes, right? So this makes it so that you don't have to request for permissions every single time. You first check if they have permissions. If they don't, you request it here. And finally, you actually run everything you want to run. So one of the things that you should do is make it so that one of the things that you might want to do is make it so that functions trigger after permissions have been granted. So if you write the after permissions have been granted annotation, it makes it so that the function triggers after the what's it called, permission has been successful. So this is an example of this. Here you see it says basically after you've requested the location and contact permissions, then and only then will it run this line of code. And finally, we have activity cycles. So for activity cycles, this is just how the Android deals with activities in the background. And here is an image of the flow state. So for any activity, it starts at starting, and then it will use those functions over here on create, on start, on resume. And once you call those, it will go into running, and then there'll be many different ways of going to different states. So, for example, if you are moving on to another application, what it could do is it could pause the first activity, and once it's in pause state, you can completely stop it, or you could destroy the entire process so it doesn't take up memory running in the background, or you can make it so that it can resume back to running. So the important thing here is just to you don't really have to know exactly this entire flow state because it's all done in the background. But say for example, just say undestroy. Okay, sorry, let me go back. So you can, when you first run the code, you'll remember that we have onCreate. We have all of our code, or most of our code, on onCreate. And this is just code that we run when the application is created. And then it'll keep on running and running, right? But say, for example, you want to do something on your app when it's paused. Well, you put that in on pause. So you want to do something when it's about to be destroyed. You put that in on destroyed, etc. Right? 95% of everything you're going to be doing is going to be on create. So you don't really have to know about it, but it's just good to keep in the back of your head that Android is doing this type of stuff in the background. This is just basically repeating what's it called? What I previously just said. Holy. So for onCreate, this callback must be implemented because it is fired when the system actually first creates your activity. If you do not have this function, nothing will run, right? And here you put most of your basic application startup logic, and that should only happen once for the entire life of the activity. Upon completion, this method will invoke onStart. So for onStart, this is the stage in the life cycle where the activity becomes visible for the user and actually initializes the UI code. This part is very, very quick, and it will then proceed to onResume. So one of the reasons why you might want to use this is because, for example, it takes a while to actually load in, let's just say, all your UI components. You might notice when you're loading into an app, you'll have a bunch of like white boxes representing where UI components will go. Well, this is an example of like why you would actually use this, right? Maybe like it takes time to communicate with the backend to load up or retrieve all the images, and so at the beginning you'll load it with all the white boxes so that you're not just having a blank screen on your app, and then only after you finish communicating with your backend do you continue to the next state. So on resume is this method is called when the app has officially begun running, and it is in the foreground, and it is just constantly being called when the user is interacting with the app. On pause, I'm mostly reading off of the screen here. The system calls this method as the first indication that the user is leaving the activity. This does not mean that the activity is being destroyed. It simply indicates that the app is no longer in the foreground. So it might put it into its call stack, and so that it's easier to go back to it later. What? Okay, we're chilling. Not continue. This method is used to pause or just operation that should not be continued. Yeah, basically on stop. So on stop, all this does is it is called when the activity is no longer visible to the users. So it's not just not in the foreground; it is just not visible. Period. And so your app will stop using memory in order to keep on holding onto it, and it will just stop running it. On destroyed, this is the method that is called right before the application is destroyed. So this could be either the temporary destruction and recreation. For example, when you're rotating your screen, it will, if you're going from landscape to portrait, it will destroy the landscape mode and then recreate everything in portrait mode. Or it is because the activity is finished. In that case, the user will be manually dismissed from the activity. So this is the final flow. It's just something for you guys to keep in the back of your head. It's not particularly important when you're currently creating your apps, but perhaps in the future when you guys are creating bigger and grander apps, you will remember this because it is important for higher level or more complex apps. And now that that's all done, it's time for some demos.
All right, so we'll be going through a quick demo, mainly on intents. If my mouse will wake up, there we go. Mainly on intents, and so today I just have pulled up an empty activity as usual. Most of your homeworks will now be basically just based off of empty activities, and so what we're going to be making today is just a simple sort of activity that will be able to open up a new activity and transfer data between those two activities. And so I'm just going to make my first my first main activity here to be a couple of text views. Let me just set this up in the constraint layout, put my constraints down in the right places, center it, say, between this text view and top. Change the font sizes of these guys because that's a little small. Text size, like 36 SP or something, make that a little bit larger. There we go. And let's make a button to access a new activity. So let me drag that in here. Center it as you probably would. And so my idea here is that I want to enter a new activity that allows me to sort of change the values of these two text views, because text views by themselves are not editable. And so I could, say, drag in some edit texts here, but if by some sort of design choice I would rather have these as just text views and then have another interface for editing them, this is a sort of method you could use, having two activities, one of which you can actually change the information, and then one of which is just the text views. And so let me just have like a default. We'll have like a name, default name, and a default fact. And this button, we will want to say edit our information here. And so in order to make a new activity or a new screen, we can just go to File, New, Activity. And we'll be going with an empty activity here. Let's call this the edit activity. It'll generate a new layout file and open it for us, as well as a Kotlin file for that specific activity. And so this is what our edit activity will look like. And so here we want to put in some input options for our users to actually be able to say edit the text to what they want their name and fact to be. So that will be our plain text. So let's drag some of those in. There we go. Center those as you would expect. The same for this guy. And let's say we want to have a button to like go back to finish the activity, actually have this information, and then send it back to the other activity so it can edit the proper fields. Let's say finish, and we can have the text here. Let's say we'll just set this programmatically whenever we open the edit activity through our intents. And so, in order to give some logic to the button, of course, we need to get a reference to it. Let's just do that very quickly. Find view by ID is your best friend now at this point. Let's say r.id.button. So this now will give us a reference to our button so we can use it in our layouts. And so now we can just set an on-click listener as you usually would. There we go. And so now I want to make an intent and actually use that to go to the other activity. And so I actually want to also get some result from this activity. And so let's go back to our slides on that. And so in order to get a result from an activity, we need to use register for activity result and use this sort of syntax here. And so, in fact, let me just pull this over to my screen. And so in order to make this syntax does get pretty tricky, so make sure if you are aiming to do something like this in your homeworks that you do just take a look at our textbook or the slides, because trust us, we don't even have this stuff memorized either. It is just a lot of syntax. And so in order to make an intent launcher, in order to go to another activity and sort of get some information, we can use the register for activity result. Enter key is super buggy. And so in order to pass a parameter to this, you can just say activity result contracts dot start activity for result. This basically just says we're going to make a new activity, open a new activity in hopes that it'll give us some information back. And the next parameter that this needs is a function. So if my FQ will work, there we go. So this function will basically, whenever your activity returns, essentially, it'll execute this function in order to give the result of that function back, or that activity back. And so let's just say our results are going to include a, well, we have to get result.data, and then you can say, I think it's extras. And let's say we want to take back the name and the fact. Then we'll want to say get string for the name and say store that for now just in some sort of variable, like a new name. And okay, well, these will all need a question mark just because the Kotlin can't be sure if they actually exist. They could be null, and so this little question mark syntax is what you need. That should be in the slides, so don't worry about that. And we want the same thing for our fact, so we can do the same thing. And so that will allow us to say get our fact. And so whenever we in our edit activity want to send this sort of information back, we have to use these same keys in order to show that these are the pieces of information that we want to send back. And so let's actually make. All right, let's actually. Oh, I shouldn't be declaring this inside my click listener, by the way. This is just like an object, some launcher that'll allow me to use it or to go into another activity whenever. And so I don't want to actually declare that in my button. But if I want to use it, then I will put it in my button, or I will put it in my button because I do want to use it to actually go to another activity. And so we'll say intent launcher.launch, and we need to pass an intent into this, and so let's make one. Say val intent equals, and so constructors in Kotlin are pretty much just you put the class name. There's no new keyword. It's just you put the class name as a constructor and put in the information. And so you'll say I want to go from this activity that I'm currently in into the one that I am aiming for, which is edit activity, and you have to put class.java. So that'll make our intent, and so we can pass that in order to launch our intent. And one thing we might want to do is say, well, our edit activity might want to populate with the values that activity main already has. So we'd want to say pass default name and pass default fact into these edit texts here, so that they automatically have what we already have. And so we can package this intent with some values. And so if we say get our extras and put a string as, say, just name, and then we could then use name to send what our current activity has as the current name. Of course, to do that, I would need to get a reference to my name, or my name text view, which let's just do very quickly by ID, or text view, import that. r.id. I'm assuming text view, and we want to do the same thing for the other one. v2. Let's just call this text v2. So one of these, I'm assuming this one is going to be our name, and this is probably going to be our fact, I'm assuming. And so we want to package our intent with the current name of our, or the current text that's in our name. And so we can say text view.text.toString. That'll get our name, our current name, and we can do the same thing for our fact. Package our fact into there. So we can say text, or this is fine text, but text view fact is the text we want to actually pull from. And so this will take information from our text view, or for our name, and then this will do the same for our fact and sort of send it in as our intent. And so in order to access this, oh yeah, more question marks. Like so, there we go. The question marks, again, are just for knowables, because these intents might not have these extras, and so putting this question mark sort of guarantees to Kotlin that, okay, yeah, I know that this is something that will be included. But anyways, going into edit activity now, and in order to pull this information out, you can say my current intent is going to equal get intent, or I guess just intent. So intent is the intent that was sent over to you when you access this activity. And so if I wanted to get the name that was passed to it, I can say my current intent, or I guess at this point I might as well just use intent. Intent dot extras dot get string, and I want to get the name here, and I can do the same for a fact. Get string for a fact. And so these values will now populate with a name and fact that was passed over by this intent for name and fact. And so now I want to change the edit text to have this information when I first open the activity. And so obviously I need a reference. So edit text for name, find view by ID, r.id dot edit text, I guess these are called something weird. Let's just say edit text name factor and edit text fact. Make those IDs a little bit more to make a little bit more sense. So edit text name, and we'll have to pass in a type here, of course. So is that automatically encoded? Oh, I believe this is just a build error. Yeah, that's if I rebuild it, that will go away. Do the same thing for our fact. r.id dot edit text fact. Okay, so I'm assuming if I build, those will go away. And so now I want to populate those edit texts with the current text that was sent in through our intent. And so those will be held in our name. In fact, if I roll over it, you see it has a little question mark here, which means it could be null. And so we do have to take that into account so that no null pointer exceptions are possibly thrown. So you could set our text by just saying edit text name dot text, and we want this to be set equal to the name, but in its current state, this will be an error because this needs to be well, this could be null, but this needs to be a non-null element essentially. And so what we could do is pass in a sort of default value for if something went wrong. So we could just say the default name if it does indeed go wrong. And why is that valid? I don't remember ever having to do that. I guess it's just because this is an edit text. I'm not exactly sure why that is. I believe I might be using the wrong method here. So set text for a string. That looks more correct. Name or default name. Not sure why there's a difference there, but it seems like we have to use set text. Sometimes it's interchangeable, and in this case, it doesn't seem like it. So we can do the same thing for our fact. And if the fact doesn't end up working, we'll just use a default fact instead. And let's actually test this out to make sure it can populate with the correct information. I guess either way would say default name. So for now, let's just say something went wrong. And same thing here. Just so we can differentiate between if it's actually working or not. Something went wrong. Wait for our emulator to pop up here. And so we're hoping that if we enter this edit activity, that the edit text will automatically populate with default name and default fact instead of something went wrong. And so when we enter this, it will say default name and default fact because that information was sent to us through the intent here. Okay, now what happens if we want to send information back? So say I want to edit these texts to my actual name and like an actual fact. Then how do I send cats are my favorite animal, something like that. And I want to send this information back. Well, first of all, this button's not going to do anything, so let's make sure let's give it some logic. Get the reference, like always. Find out ID dot. It's probably button 2 if I had to guess. Let's say button dot set on click listener. And so when we do this click, we want to go back to the other activity and we want to send the information back. And in order to do that, we need another intent in order to go back. And so we can say intent equals just a regular intent. And so we want to put a sort of information into this intent. And so we could do that with put string like we did before. And we want to put in the new name with the edit text, its current name, to string. And the same thing for our fact. Same thing for fact. Edit text for fact. These will pull out the current strings that are held in the name and the fact and put them in our intent. In order to use the intent launcher here and actually pass this sort of information into this area, we need to use set result. And in order to do that, we need to pass in some of the result code. I'm currently not looking for any result code since this is the only activity in my file, so I don't really care about differentiating between them. And I'm going to put in my intent as sort of like my result. Then I'm going to call finish, and that will sort of close the activity. And so now, whenever I call finish, it'll go to this area in my code and execute it with results being sort of the information that I just packaged into there. And so if I want, I have code already here for getting the new name and new fact. So all I have to do is say text view that text equals the new name, and the text view fact equal to the new fact. So that text, yes. It'll set the text of the name text and the fact text to whatever I had just been sent in. So let's make sure that works. Oh, something went wrong. I'm not sure exactly why that happened, but worked the first time at least. So Justin Guo, and that's are my favorite. And send this back, and hopefully now, what went wrong there? There's probably some sort of error with my code, but class time is over, so I sadly cannot debug that. I'll get back to you in exactly why that was happening, but for now, I'm not going to keep you here. it is 9:25 or past 9:25 now. So thank you all for coming. Hopefully this was at least just a little bit of an intro to Intents. We will go over, of course, a more in-depth demo on Wednesday. Thank you all for coming. Yeah,
Thank you, guys.
Thank
yeah,
you.
of course.
I have a question.
Mhm. Yeah, of course.
What's the best way to center this horizontally?
This horizontally.
Yeah.
This it is central horizontal. What do you mean?
No, I mean like if you view this as a group,
Yes.
center these two horizontally, so that would be moving it to the right.
Oh.
Of course. Have a good night.